President Biden stumbled several times on Friday morning while boarding Air Force One. But as of Friday afternoon, there was no mention of it on the home pages of MSNBC, CBS News, The Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and New York Times. Some in liberal media scoffed that everyone tripped sometimes and that Biden falling was not news. Quite a contrast with the breathless coverage of former President Trump going down a ramp at West Point. Remember this.
President Trump is facing some new questions about his health after an unsteady walk down a ramp after his commencement speech at West Point.
Images like this and even his speaking ability undercuts their argument that Biden is a doddering old man.
Maybe he just has a hard time going down a gently sloping ramp, but do you see something possibly neurological that could be throwing off his balance?
Is it balance problems? Is there some weakness there? Is there numbness in the feet?
Speculation from a doctor who's never actually sat with the former president. Even then, candidate Biden took a swipe at President Trump.
Look at how he steps and look how I step. Watch how I run up ramps and he stumbles down ramps, okay? Come on.
Hegseth.
What do you even say, Harris? I mean, it is one of the most glaring examples of how the media is fully 100% in the tank of Democrats. We know that. But the shamelessness with which they pursued a president successfully walking down a ramp, which anyone who's been on leather-toed shoes knows exactly how difficult that is. Successfully doing that versus the one. You're looking at it too, and then a third, which is, it's like the computer didn't restart on those stairs. And our channel did. People have been responsible about trying to give the president, our president of the United States, Joe Biden, grace in that moment. Never returned to Donald Trump ever once. And in this particular case, here's what the real scandal is going to be, Harris. Who knew what when? Who knew about the frailties of Joe Biden, whether physical or mental, during the campaign or during his presidency, knew about it and actively covered it up from the American people? It will come out. The books will be written eventually. The media is covering for him now, and they will continue to. But it will come out. And who knew that will be responsible for the fact that we had an absentee commander-in-chief, unfortunately.
Well, I want to say, I always say this disclaimer. None of us is a doctor, and even the doctor on CNN who was conjecturing, to my knowledge, he's never been the physician for this president or the former one. So it's hard to say, but what we can go on is having access. And since we haven't had that kind of access to really en masse as media talk with the president, I'm sure one of those questions might pop with, are you okay? He was rubbing his leg. He was clearly falling more than once. I think it's fair to ask, are you okay from that fall? And that's how you handle it. There's grace and integrity in asking the question. But by Thursday, I doubt that's what people will be talking about. Katie, who knows?
Well, Harrison, let's not forget that this is a president who just recently fractured, I believe it was his foot while he was playing with his dog at his home in Delaware. And so the follow-up questions, if the media were actually interested, are, should a Secret Service agent be escorting the president up the stairs just in case he were to fall backwards, which would cause even more serious injury? The White House pool report from reporters, there were follow-up questions about whether the president had asked or had seen the White House doctor. A reporter did ask that question, and the deputy press secretary said she didn't know, but he was doing just fine. There is no way that if President Trump fell 3 times like that, or any president who's a Republican for that matter, the answer of whether he had seen the White House doctor would be acceptable if this press secretary or deputy press secretary had said, well, I don't know if he saw the White House doctor, even though he just had a broken foot, but he's doing just fine, and leave it at that. There would have been panels of doctors, panels of experts about everything, just as we saw with Trump, and it's just unacceptable. It should be the same standard.
So, Kennedy, why does the standard change?
I don't think the standard should change. And I think you gotta have one metric and pretend you're covering your guy when you're covering the opposition. How would you do it differently? And remember when the president's doctor had that really intense press conference where they were just peppering Ronnie Jackson with question after question, and they were trying to undermine the report that he had on the former president, and, you know, really aggressively digging for underlying conditions that might be present rather in President Trump. I hope Joe Biden's okay. I really do. You know, it's like I've had 4 different foot fractures. I was on a knee scooter for 9 weeks. It sucks. I totally feel for him. I hope that he's better. And they should toss him a question about that on Thursday night so he can answer for himself. And don't give us hot malarkey and say it's the win. It's not the win. That's a very
Hot
common
malarkey.
element that people are able to traverse through at many different ages.
Emily.
I think that this is so much bigger than just Biden. This is the office of the presidency. And so with that, I think needs a certain amount of appreciation for that citizens need to know and need to understand and make sure that that office holder is in fact okay. And I think on the spectrum of acknowledgement, it would have been completely acceptable and would have quelled all of us wondering about it if they had said, the president thanks you for your well wishes. It was a slippery step combined with a windy day. He's feeling excellent. From now on, we will have, or they don't even have to formalize it, but if they station an agent at the top of the stairs at the bottom, I mean, that's a very real concern. And if that were me in the middle of those stairs, guaranteed I would be frightened at least for a while. So I can't imagine what the president himself is feeling, but definitely ignoring it does no one any service, especially the American people. And it is, again, us that deserve to know that he is okay and that he will be taken care of moving forward.
I think
White
it's
House doctor
interesting
should
that
release
two
a
of
note.
you, Katie and Emily, I'm sorry.
I was just saying the White House physician could release a note saying, I've seen the president after his fall. He's doing just fine, but we haven't seen any of that. It would be very easy.
Well, we'd have to acknowledge that, just like they'd have to acknowledge that, or they would have to, that there's a crisis at the border. I mean, I guess if you ignore enough, you don't have to worry about stuff. But both of you you and Emily looked toward the future and what would change about him going up the stairs. Because as you pointed out, Katie, if he falls backwards, that's a different story, and we pray that doesn't happen.